Well, good morning. I am Paulo Sotero, Director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. On behalf of the Wilson Center, on behalf of Anya Prusa, who is this Senior Associate of the Brazil Institute and will help us with the debate. We need people with more energy than I have to keep the debate going. And Anya will manage that. You have the flyer, the introduction. The departure point is the fact that 2019 made some news in terms of economic growth, but modest economic growth. It's good news because over the past 5 years, Brazil had been in recession or basically stagnation. The Brazilian government predicts that the economy will grow 2.4% this year and 2.5% in the following 2 years. We have part of this hopefulness stems from an economic reform program, new actors in the political scene, the reform of Social Security that was passed by Congress. Important detail, it was passed because of the leadership of the House of Representatives. The leadership on that didn't come from the executive branch. Came mostly, and people in Brazil recognize, from Congressman Rodrigo Maia, the Speaker of the House. We have supposedly important topics on the agenda for this year, especially an administrative reform, reform the structure of the state, and tax reform, as you know, is a complicated topic in any country. We have with us, we have invited 4 leading experts in Brazil in different areas. First, to discuss the economy, Mauricio Moura, from Idea Big Data, who has been collaborating with us for years now, and he will present the latest data on projections of growth and how the political forces are organizing themselves for this. Then, 3 economists, Monica de Bol, who is the senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and on her spare time, she teaches at Johns Hopkins University, School for Advanced Studies. Chris Garman, managing director for the Americas at Eurasia Group, who has also, like Monica and Mauricio, been very helpful participating in events such as this over a number of years. Mauricio Mesquita Moreira is a principal economist, trade and integration sector at the Inter-American Development Bank, and he will talk a bit about how the opening up of the Brazilian economy, or the not opening up of the Brazilian economy, which has been more of the case in recent past, will affect prospects for growth. And last but not least, we invited Amy Erica Smith, an associate professor of political science at Iowa State University and current fellow at the Wilson Center. She is an expert in religion and politics, especially evangelicals and Brazilian politics. She has a book on this, published last year, and will be featured at a debate here in next month. Last but not least, this is important, we have a delegation from the Novo Party, Partido Novo. We're here, 8 members of Congress. You are very welcome to the Wilson Center to follow this presentation, and you'll see that this is the average quality of stuff that we do here. With that modest self-congratulatory statement, I would like to offer the floor to Mauricio Moura, who will start us off.
Thank you. Good morning, Paulo. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming, all the people from the Congress. I'm basically going to present 2 surveys that we run in the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, basically about the sentiment about the current government, the overall sentiment about the future, especially this coming year. So, thank you. Where do
I have to aim at the laptop down here.
Oh, okay. So, I think I'm going to go. Yeah, sounds good. So, good morning. So first of all, one thing that I learned in 2019, and that is I've never seen since the beginning of the new democracy in Brazil, the country is so divided in terms of the public opinion, specifically about the evaluation of the federal government. So we had like a monthly survey since January last year, and this is the approval rate of a strong approval for the federal government and strong disapproval. So it's basically today we have 1/3 of the population that strongly approved the federal government, strongly approved Bolsonaro's performance, and you have and we have 35 in average, 35% people that strongly disapprove. And then we have, of course, what they call the regular. They evaluate as the government as regular. But I want to point out something. I've never seen that so constant. Even when we had PSDB and PT, we didn't have those 2 separate groups so clear as we have now in Brazil. And who are them? So basically, who are the average profile of people that approve the government? Mostly they are men. Most of them are related to any evangelical religion. Most of them are concentrated in the south and the southeast region. And the other side that disapprove, most of them in the northeast region, women. But having said that, basically also in terms of income, we have the people that approve the government is basically the middle income, the upper class in Brazil. And we have the other side that disapprove is the low income people in Brazil. And when we do run surveys, more qualitative surveys, focus groups, the middle class in Brazil are very optimistic, and we're going to see that later in the presentation, about the economy, about the future, about the transformation after the PT left the government. So if you go to middle class in big cities in Brazil, they're very optimistic. But if you go to the lowest income cities and regions in Brazil, the people feel that this government, this federal government, we never put the poor as priority. So that's the sentiment. So we have 2 countries. A lot of people in the big cities, very optimistic about the economy, and a lot of people that are more in the poor regions, very pessimistic. And that's the other way to see that is how do you ask about the evaluation? The red is bad and very bad, the yellow is regular, and the blue is very good and good. So has the same trend of the approval rate. So we have a really divided country, and I've never seen that So two extremes in the public opinion, as we see in this first year of government. Again, the same profile. So we have more, and the religion is also a factor, just to emphasize that. But anyway, it's the same bad and very good, they're opposite profiles. So last year, every year we run a survey in the end of the year asking what's the main word that comes to mind about a year in Brazil. So when you talk about 2019 in Brazil, which word comes to mind? Last year, the winner was difficulties, plural. So in 2017 was corruption, in 2018 was change, and so basically and those are every word that was mentioned during the survey. So we have difficulties, and then came hope, renewal, transformation, regress. So that's the trend. So we had corruption, change, and difficulties. Actually, this is to be honest, last year in December 2018, we ran a survey, and we had a lot of expectations for the first year of the government. And of course, those people that evaluate the government like regular, the government didn't meet those expectations. And even with the people that approved the federal government agrees that was very hard the first year of Bolsonaro. Compared to, we asked them, people, how do they compare 2019 to 2018? About what's the word in general? Much better, equal, worse, much worse, I don't know. So people think, basically, this is a very Brazilian thing. The word is not, can be worse. The Brazil can be worse, but my life is better. So this is a very Brazilian way to feel the atmosphere. So, and we asked them what's best and worst areas during the first year of Bolsonaro administration. By far, the best area was economy. So it's so they say very good and good 29%, regular 15%, and bad and very bad about the economy. So the economy for sure was the highlight of the government. So this was and the worst environment, education. So those are the things that even people that evaluate economy as good and very good, was evaluating the environment, the way the government is leading with the environment, very badly. So we have this. So we have economy on one side, environment and education on the other side. Just tell me, in the last week, we had a lot of issues with the national exam called ENEM. So probably if I run the survey today, it would be education. But having said that, the Brazilians are very optimistic. When you ask them about how the things are going to go in 2020, if they expect the reduction of unemployment, 60% expects the reduction of unemployment. They expect economy improvement, 60% expects that the economy will improve. Expect the public security improvement. They are also very optimistic about public security. Increase in consumption of durable goods, education improvement, health improvement. So the message here is that even if we do have a divided country, we do have different evaluations from different sectors of the government, but overall I see what I haven't seen during, for example, the Dilma's years. So I see some optimism in general about the next year. So those are the basic stuff. One thing that I want to mention is that we have elections coming this year, the municipal elections, and I want to mention the 4 pillars that I'm seeing about municipal elections. First of all, municipal elections, from the surveys that we do have, are going to be about local issues. So there is no national discussion on those municipal elections. People are going to be concerned about the local public school, the local streets, the local public safety. So that's the first thing. Second, we had in Brazil in 2018 a whole group of people that were elected basically saying that they were outside the system, outside the establishment. This is not going to be enough in 2020. people are expecting the people that are going to be elected for solving local issues, solving local problems. So they're going to see, again, the voters are going to see to candidates outside the corruption system, but also they're going to expect some people that deliver. So that's a big difference. The third thing that I'm seeing is that there's going to be the election of fake news in Brazil. So fake news is going to take a lot of energy and resources from campaigns, from press, from the voters. And we do have now what they call deep fake videos that look like very real, but are not real. So I'm seeing a lot of the increase of fake news all over the place, and this election is going to be also about fake news. And last but not least, and people that were elected here know better than me, this is going to be election of the cellular phone. So people are going to discuss politics, receive news of politics, share comments about politics in the cellular phone. This is not going to be the discussion about TV versus radio versus social media. The election is going to be on the cellular phone. So those are, and to be honest with you, I don't think the presidency itself or the president are going to be a key role or a key player in the municipal elections. Every survey that we run, the people are much more concerned about their local issues. So don't expect that this divided country are going to play in the municipal elections.
All right. Chris, do you want to go next?
Oh, great. Did you receive a PowerPoint you sent?
No. Did you send it to?
It was last minute, but that's don't worry about it.
Say we can go to Monica if you want to give us a chance to get yours.
Monica doesn't have a PowerPoint, so we
So
can,
that sounds
we can
good.
listen to Chris first.
Okay. Absolutely. Happy to comply. Well, first and foremost, just to say this, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Paulo, for the invitation to participate in this event. It's always a tremendous honor to be able to participate with such a stellar cast. I'll try to keep my comments succinct, and kind of let me just kind of begin with making some of the more important points that I'd like to be able to defend here in these 10 minutes. First, certainly, kind of as we're following politics in Brasilia, I think everyone sees what Mauricio just put on the screen. Right, we're in the middle of a very divided country. We're in the midst of highly polarized politics. We have a president who was elected on an anti-establishment platform, and he continued to campaign on an anti-establishment rhetoric during his first year in the administration. When he got into difficulties, he campaigned against the political class. The relationship between party leaders and the administration is not a good one. Party leaders don't trust this president. This president doesn't treat them like allies, and I think it's fairly safe to say that this administration will never have a working majority in Congress. And at the same time, we have a pretty ambitious task before us in terms of the need to tackle a number of structural economic reforms to increase GDP growth potential. But I'd like to argue that despite all that Brazil is probably in the middle of what we at the Eurasia Group consider to be probably the broader, deeper reformist agenda of any emerging market out there, and that the political conditions for these reforms to advance in 2020 are pretty constructive, despite the fact that we're headed into a relatively tight legislative calendar with municipal elections in the second half of the year. This is a delicate equilibrium. There are risks on the horizon, but I think that the key for us to focus on analytically is what is driving legislative incentives before this reform agenda, not necessarily what's coming out of the executive office. So let me unpack that statement. First, just a quick word on kind of the agenda out there. If you kind of look at the reforms on the table and a kind of a cursory glance, they are pretty ambitious. The administration began with the approval of pension reform. But there is still a number of fiscal proposals on the table. The economic team sent 3 proposals for constitutional reform in the Senate, which is part of the broad federal fiscal pact, which, broadly speaking, is a mix between trying to be able to control obligatory spending growth in order to be able to ensure that the constitutional cap on spending is respected for the coming years. And in exchange, to varying degrees, you transfer revenue to state and municipal governments, or you de-index abroad of federal funds. In the lower house, you have the promise of the administration sending a constitutional proposal for administrative reform, which sets new rules for compensation and career structures for new entrants to the public service. The lower house is deliberating on a overhaul of the tax code, of the value-added tax, simplifying, unifying 5 VAT taxes. And then you look at the, the microeconomic reform agenda, kind of pipelines of measures in oil and gas and utilities and logistics infrastructure, financial services, add a trade opening agenda and a privatizations agenda, and this looks pretty darn broad, right? Now, what's the pessimistic appraisal of all this? The pessimistic appraisal runs like the following. Yes, we were able to get a pension reform approved in 2019, but they were driven by very atypical, let's say, constellation of interests. The political class in Congress, coming out of a massive election in which the rates of renewal were very low, were afraid of the kind of public anger and the prospect of a sustained economic crisis. Everyone understood that not doing pension reform could develop another economic crisis. Nobody wanted that. And so the opportunity cost of not doing that was very high. And at the same time, the public opinion debate on pension reform was going favorable. Support for pension reform was rising. Opposition was dropping. So the reputational cost of putting your name on this bill was low, and the opportunity cost of not doing anything very big, right? So therefore, a government was able to get a pension reform with the leadership of Rodrigo Maia, particularly in the lower house, get done. But you look at the next round of reforms that I just listed, the 3 proposals for constitutional reform in the Senate, administrative reform, tax reform, they don't have those characteristics. It's not as if financial markets are going to enter into a crisis if one of these don't get done, and it's not as if any of these have been debated in the public and support has risen. So then the pessimistic narrative is, we'll get some things done, but don't expect much. The window is very short. Legislative work stops in July. And so we'll just get a muddle-through scenario in 2020. We don't endorse that view. And the reason, even though we had that view for a good part of last year, the more that we did the rounds in Congress, both in the lower house and the Senate, and I'm very happy that we have members of the delegation of the Nova Party here so they can chime in, what we started to realize at the Eurasia Group is that there's an absolutely fascinating game going on in Congress, which is there is a redefinition of the electoral survival strategies of many parties in the lower house and in the Senate, in a context where having resources from the executive office in terms of pork and patronage did not guarantee them re-election in last year's election, in a context where public opinion and disapproval ratings remain very high, and in a context where the administration is not playing the game of distributing cabinet positions and second and third tier appointments to generate a coalition. And so in this world, the electoral survival strategy of I'm going to condition my vote to be able to have appointments in the federal bureaucracy, right, is no longer there, right? And what we have been detecting is that party leaders are seeing this second generation of reforms in their electoral self-interest. And part of the reason why also has to do with what I would argue may very well be the largest institutional legacy of the Bolsonaro administration, right, which is the strengthening of the executive or the legislative branch on budget and spending prerogatives, right? Let me just take a small little step back and go through a little bit of a wonky poli-sci point, but I think it's important. Political scientists like to characterize presidential democracies in terms of the strength of the executive office and the strength of the legislative branch, right? If you look at, and they usually measure them in terms of the degree of legislative powers, the degree of appointment powers, and the degree of budgetary powers. After 1998, Brazil had one of the strongest executive branches out there on a comparative metric. And that grand bargain worked because if you have a lot of discretion in the executive office and you have an overarching legislative coalition, you use the discretionary powers on appointments and spending to benefit your allies and to hurt your enemies. And so Congress is happy with that equilibrium if they're getting satisfied. But what happens is that when Congress doesn't feel represented by the executive office, or the executive office is very weak, they start to retract the executive discretionary powers. The first step was 2001. We limited the use of provisional measures. And then came Dilma Rousseff, where you had a constitutional amendment for emendas parlamentares impositivas, which means you have a budgetary amendment, and the executive office doesn't have the leeway to be able to say, I will disperse this amendment or not. And this last year, we're in hyperdrive. We approved 2 proposals for constitutional reform, which restricted the use of budgetary amendments and strengthened the power of the rapporteur of the budget. In other words, now, this next year, right, the executive office will no longer have the discretion to say this budget amendment can go to this legislator, this one can't, right? Why is that important? Because when the legislature brought back the discretionary powers over control of the budget to Congress, they become self-interested actors in fiscal responsibility. Because the game in Congress is to ensure that obligatory spending doesn't rise and we don't have a fiscal crunch, and they can increase the share of budgetary amendments, and they control those resources, right? So when you look at the proposals for constitutional amendment right now, which is the Fiscal Emergency Plan, PAC 186, the Federal Pact 188, and the revision of pension public funds, we think all those 3 constitutional proposals for reform will get approved. When it comes to the fiscal emergency of 186, we're hearing that it should get relatively quick approval in the Senate, to a vote in the committee in February, maybe a vote in March, and this could go to the lower house in April, right? Because what we're seeing is that legislators want to be able to approve these measures and then increase the share of resources that they control. Interesting game as well in tax reform. Again, the economic team doesn't want a broad tax reform that's in the lower house. They want incremental federal VAT tax, corporate income tax. But party leaders in the lower house, what we're hearing, and Rodrigo Maia really wants an ambitious kind of VAT reform. And part of the reason is that governors have an unprecedented unanimity around overhauling their state-based ICMS tax because the revenue base has also stalled and they can't give additional tax breaks. There's a lot of nuance here, but we don't think it actually gets approved this year. We're only giving this a 40% probability because this is a whole redistribution of the tax burden from industry to services. It's going to be a little bit of a political food fight. We think this will drag into 2021, but I'll tell you, I'm hearing party leaders saying that they think that this will get out of the lower house first half of this year, and coordinating with the Senate, this could get done this year, which is an upside surprise, right? Same thing with administrative reform, right? So when we look at a local election here, we can approve at least potentially multiple proposals for constitutional reform. Now, so I think that I just wanted to give you a little bit of a glimpse that the game isn't to focus on Bolsonaro, isn't on his polarizing rhetoric. The game is to focus on how are party leaders surviving in this environment, and do they see these reforms in their self-interest? I think the answer is yes. Now the question is, what's the risk, right? The risk is what can change the legislative calculus on these reforms. So what worries us at Eurasia Group is a scenario of a mixture of frustration on the growth side, mixed with social unrest that we've seen in the region. Some of the conditions are still in Brazil, even though we're not seeing conditions right now, right? And then if you have an environment of social discontent rising, that legislators may no longer have a majority coalition in favor of these reforms, and they may take steps in the opposite direction, like increasing obligatory spending to education, like a Fundeb, which is a proposal also being deliberated in Congress. But I'll tell you that what happens in the next 6 to 8 months will be very, very important for Brazil's outlook for the next couple of years. Because if you take steps on this agenda, you guarantee the fiscal anchor on the fiscal emergency reform. You guarantee the spending cap is resolved. You anchor lower real interest rates, and you have progress on the microeconomic reform agenda. We're in a virtuous cycle, potentially. And then who substitutes Rodrigo Maia after the end of this year? It doesn't matter as much because you're a little bit in cruise control, right? Now, if social pressure rises, growth frustrates, and Congress takes a step backwards, markets will get into a tailspin, the confidence on investments drops, and we're in for a world of hurt for the second half of the administration. So I think that at the end of the day, I do think that the success on this will be very important for shaping the remainder of the mandate. Thank you.
I think this is working.
Yes, it's working.
Is it? Okay. No, I don't have the green light thingy, but I think it's working. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Paulo, once again for inviting me to be here. Welcome to you. And welcome to the rest of you. My take is a little bit different from Chris, or perhaps a world apart from Chris's. So I'll start with,
It's a good thing. Polarized politics.
yes,
on the
well,
panel.
we have polarized views is a good thing when we can chat,
That's right,
And when we
absolutely.
can talk. So, so let me start with what I see as the big themes in Brazil. And quite frankly, yes, reforms, you know, we've been talking about reforms endlessly, and we kind of get tired of talking about them. And to me, to be perfectly honest, if we do get some of these reforms through, of course, that's a good thing. But what I'm most concerned about are not really those reform trends or, you know, whatever can come out of them, because there are a lot of structural issues in Brazil which are of much greater concern to me and which do not involve the fiscal accounts as such, but involve things which go much deeper. So to me, I'm less concerned about short-term projections. And by the way, you know, the short-term projections that we have coming out of the IMF and others is that growth will hover around 2% in 2020. Just to remind all of us, it so happens that in the last few years, we start off the year with rather optimistic growth projections, and we end the year with realistic results. So last year we had projections of about 3.5% to 4%, the most optimistic out there were saying this, and we ended the year with 1% growth, which has actually been the trend over the last 3 years if we look at that. To me, that signals not that we have an excess capacity problem, which is something that a lot of people seem to believe, but rather that we have a collapse. We've had a collapse in the potential growth of the Brazilian economy. And I think one thing that does illustrate that very clearly is the non-reaction to low interest rates. So Brazil has now had low interest rates for a while, actually low interest rates from a historical standpoint when it comes to Brazil. This is both on the nominal side as well as on the real side. And we have seen little to no reaction of the economy to these low interest rates. So in a way, Brazil seems to be caught, or resembles at least, a kind of an advanced economy secular stagnation, which begs the question of what are these underlying problems, structural problems that really plague the economy. Now, we often hear of, you know, high taxes. That's part of the Brazil cost, or the so-called custo Brasil. We often hear about low productivity and a lot of other issues. And of course, they're all true. Of course, if we have a tax reform, that will be positive. Although I do have to say one point about a VAT-based tax system. Let's not forget that a VAT-based tax system is highly regressive by nature. And every single country that does have a VAT-based tax system also has compensatory mechanisms to reduce the level of regressiveness that VAT entails. In fact, VAT and not having compensatory mechanisms for VAT-based tax systems is one of the reasons why Chile is in the situation that it is in. As if you have been following the protests there, one of the things that people were complaining about was precisely the tax structure, which is VAT-based and very highly regressive. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and that's certainly one thing that I think has been mentioned here by the other panelists. This is not a government that's very much concerned about social impact. So we need to keep that in mind, especially in view of the fact that the region is anything but calm at the moment. In terms of the long-term issues that worry me, there are two. And they came out in Mauricio's surveys, opinion surveys, as the two things that are foremost, that are of foremost concern in people's minds. Those two things are, on the one hand, the environment, and on the other hand, education. Now, if we want to talk about the economy as a separate issue from everything else that goes on policy-wise in this government, we're going to be making a big mistake. And the way that I've seen things discussed in Brazil is that the economy is often discussed separately from everything else. So we tend to focus on pension reform and tax reform and administrative reform. And we forget that these other areas like the environment and education do matter for long-term economic trends. They're not split apart from the economic agenda. So let me say a word about those two things. If we look around the world right now, the main issue when it comes to public investment and when it comes to reforming economies, the main issue is climate change and the environmental agenda. Brazil has no climate climate agenda whatsoever. In fact, it seems to have a very, well, there's a nice deforestation of the Amazon forest out there if any of you want to see it. I've also written a paper about that. So we know that policies on the environmental front have been going backwards, not forwards. And clearly, this is not a government that has at its center a view towards environmental policy that is consistent with a view of the economy as a whole, because it sees these two things as being separate. That is not how the rest of the world is dealing with these issues. If we just look at the debate that's going on in Europe right now, where countries are facing some form of secular stagnation, as I mentioned in the beginning, that Brazil seems to be suffering too. The discussion there is about decarbonization and how do you make fiscal, monetary, public investment policies, all of these things come together under the agenda of decarbonization. If you want to be a modern economy, if you want to look towards the future, that is where the discussion needs to be. And that is not where the discussion is in Brazil at all. Brazil being potentially a global, let's say, power in the environment, potentially. It's not exercising its potential right now. It's doing just the opposite. So that's one thing that greatly concerns me, because the country is going backwards, not forward. On education, and this being the second biggest concern amongst the Brazilian population and also a grave concern of mine, if we look at the trends in productivity growth in Brazil, and if we know a thing or two about human capital and how human capital acts within the economy to generate higher growth, we should all be extremely concerned about what the medium to long-term prospects in Brazil are. There's no education policy to speak of in Brazil. The PISA results that Brazil keeps getting every 3 years are absolutely dismal. I have talked about this issue here before in previous occasions. The results that we just got from the last PISA were just as bad. So on literacy, maths, and sciences, Brazilian students don't even reach level 2 of the OECD. Level 2 is the minimal capacity that students need to have. So in other words, and there's no differentiation between higher or upper middle class and higher income students and lower income students. Everybody does it equally bad on that score. So we're doing very badly on education, which means that going forward, we're going to produce a workforce that is mainly low skilled, and it's not going to generate much in the way of productivity, and we should be very concerned about that. That matters. Again, education policy matters for what we think the economy is going to be like going forward. So just touching on those two issues and leaving the others aside for Q&A, because Paulo's already telling me that I'm beyond my time. He's going like this and showing me his watch. I'll leave it at that, but just to say that, reforms aside, and even if all of these reforms get passed, I quite frankly can't see how a government that does not have a broader, holistic agenda for the country as a whole, and which is focusing exclusively on more fiscalist issues, can actually bring this country out of the current quagmire that it's in. Thank you.
Mauricio?
Is it on? Yeah. Well, good morning, deputados. Paulo, thank you very much for the invitation. Paulo asked me to talk about, the prospects of trade liberalization and, implications for Mercosur and for growth. And, following up on Monica's presentation, this is pretty much a long-term structural issue, which has clearly, growth implications. And, these days, whenever somebody asks me about those prospects of trade liberalization in Brazil, I can't help thinking about, Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, and all the existential angst that comes with it. After all, it's been nearly a century of very high tariffs. It was a policy that, started in the Great Depression. And, to be fair, in the 90s, we made a substantial effort to reduce those tariffs. But we stopped halfway. Since the mid-90s, we actually had a number of important policy reversals And this policy reversals means in practice that after 30 years of efforts to liberalize the economy, we still have one of the most closest economies in the world, whether you measure that by de jure indicators like tariffs or de facto indicators like trade to GDP ratios. So this chronic form of protectionism has clearly had a cost in terms of growth in Brazil. We just published a report exactly on this long-term impacts of trade liberalization. And we find that, particularly in Latin America, the countries that did liberalize, went further and liberalized, the country had a bonus growth of 1 percentage point per capita growth per year, which, doesn't sound much, but if you accumulate that in 20 years, it's pretty much, and it couldn't be better illustrated by what happens in the second mandate of President Dilma, where all the protectionist measures had a big contribution in terms of our worst recession in history, and then all the mayhem in terms of the institutional crisis, all the corruption, the rent seeking that came of it. So it's a big issue, and you can imagine how happy I was when the previous government, the Temer government, started talking liberalization. So although I tried to control my expectations given all this disappointment in this last 30 years, they didn't actually manage to do something substantial. To be fair, they didn't have much time. So then came along this current government, and they also start talking about liberalization was part of their campaign promises, and so I tried to hang on to my hopes. And what can we say about what happened after 1 year of government? So I would say that I'm not sure if I'm optimistically skeptical or I'm skeptically optimistic about those things. On the bright side, they did do something, some substantial things. You have the EU Mercosur finally approved after 20 years. The EFTA Mercosur as well. There's a number of negotiations which are significant. Not the type of India Mercosur agreements we had in the past. They are saying that we're going to join the plurilaterals in the WTO, the technological goods, the government procurement. They even said that we're going to renounce the right to self-declare as a developing country in the WTO, which was something that was used as cover to continue our protectionist policies. So there's clearly something to show there. We have to acknowledge that. But on the other hand, I don't think this is enough. The preferential route to liberalization is not enough for a very simple reasons. These agreements take at least a decade or more to be implemented. The case of EU Mercosur, the biggest of them, is going to take 15 years to be implemented, and quite frankly, the country cannot afford to wait another 15 years to, for instance, to pay 40% less for the cars we buy. So we do need to complement this strategy with an unilateral move. Try to bring tariffs down at least to the OECD level. And clearly what happened is that this type of proposal, which was mentioned in the campaign, somehow disappeared from public discourse. And what worries me is that this kind of move, which I think is essential for the liberalization, it needs some time to be implemented. And you just can, go overnight and say that, you're going to cut tariffs in half. You need at least 4 years, announce or pre-announce schedules, just like we did in the 90s, just like most of the developing countries have done. So we're already in the second year of the government, and to go ahead and do that, there's an issue of timing consistency. If a president says that he's going to liberalize, but this process is going to go beyond its mandate, who's going to believe that this is something that's really going to happen? So you have a problem there. The second problem is, you also need institutional reform. I mean, Brazil, as like all the others Latin American countries, trade policy is very much in the hands of the executive. So with all the political volatility we have in the region, so we need somehow checks and balance and try to give some of this power on trade policy to Congress, to make sure we have more stability, on running trade policy and give, firms a longer horizon. So it's clearly something that we need to worry about. The other thing is Brazil is part of a custom union, so you can't just go and say that we're going to cut tariffs in half. We need to, negotiate with our partners. And here, I think it's pretty clear. If there's something that we learned in the last 30 years, is the fact that customs union doesn't work. It was never fully implemented. We need to acknowledge that. I mean, we can't just pretend it didn't happen. And I'm sure there's, a lot of the Argentinos I talked to, and I think Brazil, there's clearly a consensus in the sense that, or near consensus, there's never consensus in Brazil, that, we need to move towards a free trade zone. Not, do away with Mercosur, but keep Mercosur in a sustainable way that, give freedom for countries to negotiate their agreements and to have their own tariffs. For the simple reason that, the political cycles in our countries never align. So we keep getting, being held up by the other countries. So we clearly need to do that. And the other thing that worries me is that, recently we've seen in the news that, the president of Fiesp, or Fiesp as a whole, has joined the political base of the government. And, as you know, Fiesp has been, a powerful lobby for protection in this last, 30 years at least. And somehow you also see that the political discourse of the government seems like to take this shape very similar to all the previous government. Well, we're going to do the liberalization whenever, we get, the field level. I mean, we need to fix taxes, we need to fix infrastructure, we need to fix the capital market, we need to fix education. So, in other words, I mean, we can do liberalization whenever Godot shows up, in the area. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Amy, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you in just a moment, but I know our delegation from Partido Novo will have to leave shortly at 10 o'clock, I think. And I wanted to offer you the opportunity, if there was anything you would like to say to comment on what our panelists have said so far, or if anyone wanted to say a few words on the year ahead. No pressure, if you'd prefer not to. This is on the record.
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm going to give my card so we can just later
Let's hear the last. She's the last presenter,
Yes.
isn't it? Let's give her a chance to speak,
right.
and after that we make a comment. Right? Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank
if
you so
get
much
a
for
little
coming.
bit late, it's
All right.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're getting your PowerPoint up right now.
Shall I come over there to
If
You can. It should work from there.
I think so.
It should.
working on.
Yeah, we didn't have it plugged in properly before.
Okay, so I can sit or I can,
You should be able to.
or otherwise I have to pull up the microphone. All right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you guys for the invitation, and I'm delighted to have our congressional delegation here. Thank you to Paulo for inviting me and to Anya and Lara for putting this together. I'm delighted to be here with all of these really smart people. Okay, so when Paulo invited me to come in and discuss, he said, okay, so you're the political scientist. You come in and you tell them why all of these indicators don't matter for politics. I think that's the way Paulo pitched it to me. I might have it wrong. And as the contrarian. So he asked me to come in as a contrarian, and I'm going to, as a contrarian, come in at this a slightly different way. I'm going to say that these indicators do matter, but not necessarily in the ways that we think they should rationally. So yes, the economy does affect politics, but it affects politics in ways that are not necessarily the sort of rational model of accountability that we would like to see happen in elections. So I'm going to highlight 3 pieces of research, none of them actually my own research, but 3 recent pieces of research in political science and economics that suggest that the Brazilian economy is mattering for politics and society, but in ways, again, that are not necessarily terribly rational. So the first piece I'm going to highlight, I'm actually highlighting a lot of research from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. So the first piece of research is from Daniela Campello and Cesar Zucco at FGV. The second is from some economists at FGV. And the third is from a professor at Ohio State University. So to take Campello and Zucco's recent research, they ask, does the president get credit and blame for things that the president didn't do? And the answer is resoundingly yes. Brazilian presidents get lots of credit and blame for all kinds of economic performance that have nothing to do with what they did. So they take sort of, they take external economic indicators that are entirely unrelated to presidential performance. So US interest rates, commodities prices, things that Brazilian presidents have very little control over at least in the short term. One might argue that in the long term, it's possible that Brazilian presidents have some impact on these. So they find that Brazilian presidents get lots of credit and blame for things like US interest rates that have absolutely nothing to do with US interest rates. So I think this has a lot of implications for how we understand Chris's presentation. So Chris is talking about how Parliament is really driving economic reform right now. But what we have to recognize, Congress may be driving economic reform, but in the way the Brazilian electorate thinks about the economy and thinks about politics, the Brazilian electorate is going to give a lot of that credit. I'm sorry to say this, but the Brazilian electorate is going to give much of the credit for whatever you guys do to Bolsonaro. So if you want to take credit for the Brazilian economy, you're going to have to think about how this works, because the credit is certainly going to go to Bolsonaro for whatever happens. One might argue that this has implications for how he's handling, say, Sérgio Moro's position right now, but that's a longer-term story. So the credit's going to go to Bolsonaro one way or the other. I won't go through their research because I don't have enough time. But I would like to talk about it later. Okay, the second paper I'm going to highlight is from Francisco Costa and some co-authors at FGV. They look at how the economy influences evangelical conversion. So while the president may get credit and blame for lots of things that the president didn't do, all kinds of other societal impacts are also happening as a result of the economy. So one of the unexpected, at least for people who haven't been thinking about this for a long time, one of the unexpected impacts of the economy is on something that seems pretty distant, may seem pretty distant to many of us, which is on evangelical conversion. So researchers at FGV have shown, this has long been a hypothesis that people like me, scholars of religion, have been researching, but they show at the municipal level that municipalities that experienced trade shocks in the 1980s and 1990s were subsequently more likely to have conversion to Pentecostalism. The reason is, Pare de sofrer. I mean, the reason is that the title of their paper says it all. It's about stopping suffering. So Pentecostal churches are particularly effective at talking to people who are dealing with all kinds of what somebody called the pathogens of poverty, what a scholar of religion called the pathogens of poverty. So Pentecostal churches are designed to help people deal with these pathogens of poverty. And neoliberal reforms inadvertently helped to trigger changes in religiosity in Brazil. And as all of you guys know, these has long-term implications for politics in Brazil as well. The rise of evangelical politicians may inadvertently be a result of the of neoliberal transformation and neoliberal shocks in municipalities in the 1980s and 1990s. Okay, so I'm going to once again skip through their methods. The last paper that I want to highlight is one from Sarah Brooks at Ohio State University. Sarah Brooks studied the impact of exposure to risk, exposure to economic risk, and exposure to security risk on people's levels of political participation. So we can think of the paper from FGV and this paper as almost the mirror images of each other. While economic risk in many municipalities in Brazil led people to switch to Pentecostalism as a way to manage their, again, these pathogens of poverty, it also led them to withdraw from civil society. So what she finds is that people who are most at risk, who are experiencing, who have the weakest social safety net in terms of ability to connect to sort of savings accounts, people who don't have savings accounts, people who don't have access to Bolsa Familia. So the what was once called the new middle class in Brazil, which is to say people who've risen above the level of poverty that would be give them access to Bolsa Familia, but who nonetheless are really very precarious in their economic situation. That these people tend to withdraw from political participation. They may be going to church more, but they're not participating in politics as much anymore because they just don't have the time. They're investing their energies in other things that can help them manage the risks of their daily lives. So, to come back to all of this, what if the economy matters in all the wrong ways? The economy matters in the sense that we have exaggerated presidential accountability. People are voting for the president for things that the president didn't do objectively. And people will vote for the president based on things that the president didn't do. Oddly, it triggers religious conversion. And it can trigger reduced political participation. So what does all this mean? We have Monica De Bolle was talking about long-term structural problems in Brazil. And I think the answer to all of these is that we need to think of the Brazilian economy not just in a short-term perspective, but in a longer-term perspective of what are the big structural factors going on in Brazil. So raising educational levels are things that it's not a short-term and easy solution. It's probably easier to pass all of these constitutional reforms that Chris Garman was talking about than it is to reform the education system. Reforming education will be an extraordinarily difficult task, but it is absolutely essential for addressing these longer-term structural issues that we're seeing in the economy, the sort of downstream ramifications of the economy. And while Cesar Zucco and Daniel Campello were talking about these, the insertion of the economy into the national, into the globalization of the Brazilian economy as effectively exogenous to presidents' behavior. That is to say that presidents have very little control in the short term over the extent to which they're inserted in the global economy. In the long term, these are things that presidents have some control over in Brazil, and that legislatures have some control over. So thinking in the long term is going to be really important for understanding, or for addressing these long-term structural issues. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks to all our panelists. Yeah. I think we have a mic that should be coming around. Great.
Okay. Thank you. Since we're literally out of time, I'll just make some brief comments, introduce a little bit of ourselves as well, the 8 representatives of Novo that are here. But first, I would really like Paulo to thank the Wilson Center for having us here. It's definitely a head start for us. We're here for the next 3 days for an immersion that we proposed to ourselves. We do it every year. This year we decided to do it in Washington, D.C. With the help of Amanda and Jeff and the people of Acton, who've been very helpful too, together with the embassy, to set this whole agenda for us. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to see such a diverse and quality panel about our country, about what we want, also to accomplish in the following year, 2020. We are 8 representatives in first mandate. One of the things that about Brazil is there's a long struggle against privileges that people normally say that are way too much, that politicians have, and also in other sectors in Brazil, even more than the politicians have. And we try to do our best in cutting off in our own privileges, the ones we are entitled to. For instance, we could have up to 25 members in our staff. We have not more than, on average, 7. We don't use more than 50% of what we are entitled to in reimbursements and so on. And this trip is also privately funded, be it by us, ourselves, paying the tickets and so on, or by private partners who are making it possible for us to be here. But of course, Novo is not only this. We have a long term view as well. This is why education, environment, and other subjects are great importance to us. We've been born as a party that has a strong defense for the citizen, power back to the individual. So we defend free markets, we defend property rights, we defend a country where everybody is allowed to pursue happiness. And this is naturally not only on economics, where we had indeed a very big role in the last year. We agree that the executive power had the merit of sending a pension reform, that the parliament had the merit of making it happen there. But of course, we also like to remember that the Novo Party was a party that most strongly supported of all other parties this pension reform proposal, even more than the party that used to be the party of the president, and even more in many times than the proposal that was sent by the Ministry of Economics. And the same will happen in the following months. So we have here some specialists in different areas here. Alexis, for instance, in the tax system reform will have a key role. Paulo Ganimi also, he's going to become our new leader. I'm the leader of the fraction at the moment. We have Gilson Marques of Santa Catarina. He is from the Constitutional Committee in Parliament, just to introduce everybody. So we have Adriana Ventura here from São Paulo as well. She takes care more of health and social issues. Lucas Gonzalez in the mining sector and transport. Thiago Mitro, education, and Vinicius Poit, more focused on entrepreneurship. So we're all first mandate representatives. I am the only one who has held office before as a state representative and a city councillor. All of the remainder never ran a campaign before, and now we're all together for our first mandate in Parliament, and we're very, very happy indeed to be here, to be at Wilson Center, to hear you, and to bring back home the comments you made. And if you have any question to us, we will also be very happy to answer it later on via email and so on, because and we're here in town until Wednesday. Last not least, we have an event set up for Tuesday evening, right, for Brazilians in Washington, and it's open, right, Amanda? So now it's open. If it weren't, where will it be again? At the rooftop of? Eaton Hotel. So at the rooftop of Eaton Hotel, if any one of us want to share some.
Well, Americans are also welcome.
Americans are also welcome. And if any one of you want to share some thoughts and share some drinks as well, you're all welcome to join us tomorrow evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're happy to facilitate the exchange. All right. So then we're going to take questions from the audience. Once the delegation has left, they have another appointment. All right. If you have a question for our panelists, just raise your hand and we're going to send the mic around. Right here in the front.
Comprar Brasil, né? Comprar Brasil.
Yeah, well, you guys got a lot of play today. It was just a mistake, or not me, just a coincidence. Yeah.
All right.
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay.
Sorry, tell me your name.
Adriana.
Tá ótimo.
Are you in political science or in?
Obrigada. Obrigada.
All right. If you want to go ahead with your question then, sir.
Peter Bogart, formerly World Bank and other things, and now an institute in Germany. This is to the last issues which you discussed on the problem between economy and its negative impact on political participation. We have this process of people going from Catholicism to Protestants for a long time in Brazil. I mean, it's nothing new. And is there an accelerating trend for this? And can you measure this? Have you measured it? And then if you are joining these particular churches, they themselves are political. I mean, so obviously the leadership there. So I do not see there any clear-cut, retreat from politics.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't understand the whole question. I was distracted by the noise. The question was, are churches engaging in politics? Was that your question?
Among others, because to what extent your negative trend of political participation is indeed true. I mean, how do you measure this?
Right. Yeah, so I think that putting these two papers together is really interesting. And I would like to invite you. I'm going to be having a talk on my book, which was just published in April of last year, where I address these questions. So I think putting these two papers together is really interesting because I think I think that the Sauer Books paper misses part of the story, which is that participation in non-religious civil society may be decreasing at the same time that participation in religious civil society may be increasing as a result of economic shocks. So both of these trends may happen at the same time. And I think that putting these two papers together tells us something about how things are happening in Brazil, that economic shocks are leading people to withdraw from some kinds of political participation, sort of the extra things, the sort of the icing on the cake that isn't really necessary for immediate short-term personal survival, but that participation in church is perceived in some way differently because participation in church, particularly in Pentecostal churches, helps people deal with, again, what to use the phrase, the pathogens of poverty, that participation in church helps people address it helps people develop social safety nets. And to the extent that you believe that, say, prosperity theology gospel, if you believe in prosperity theology, which is to say that the belief that divine intervention can actually help you advance materially in this life, then you're going to participate more in that kind of a church. And then, yes, Pentecostal churches are very politically engaged. So there's a different kind of political participation that is happening now as a result of Pentecostal churches.
Can I add two things? First one, I agree with you. The conversion always have been an issue. However, what's happening now is that the fertility level of evangelicals are higher than the average in Brazil. So they have children younger, and they have more children. That's the new phenomenon. So there is a projection that in 2050, Brazil is going to be a majority an evangelical country. Having said that, my experience is that you don't win any majority election in Brazil without speaking to those neo-Pentecostal groups. So it's part of the political game right now. If you are a majority candidate, you have to talk to engage with those groups.
As far as demographic trends for Pentecostals, well, we could talk about this for a long time, but the demographic trends suggest a large part of it is conversion, and I haven't seen the data on differences in birth rates, but a large part of the demographic trends are conversion, and the conversion is projected to continue, and there are probably also differences in birth rates that I haven't seen data on.
Yeah, we can share it.
So just one small point on that question that speaks to what Amy was saying. I have a rather short article that was published in a book last year in Brazil on sort of the overall political and economic situation. And this particular article looks specifically at the evangelicals. And what I did there was cross the data from municipalities, from the different municipalities in Brazil, and the share of evangelicals in each municipality. And then I crossed that with the share of the vote. That was based on the 2010 census. And I crossed that with the vote, the second round vote on Bolsonaro, to see if there was any significant correlation between the share of evangelicals in a given location and the votes, and how much of the vote he actually achieved in the second round. And the correlation was not only very strong, but it did suggest very strongly that those municipalities with a larger share of the evangelical population, the percentage of the vote that went to Bolsonaro in the second round was above and beyond 60%, which speaks to a lot of what Amy was saying.
A question in the back.
Thank you, Alex Sanchez James. Two questions about two specific projects. One, last year, I remember that the state-run bank, Banco do Brasil, was trying to become fully privatized, and President Bolsonaro voted against it, decided this was not a good idea. What was his logic behind this decision when he's been trying to push for a privatization program in the country? Second one has to do with Boeing and Embraer. I understand that the deal has already been signed, but the European Union watchdogs have been delaying their approval of this merger because apparently both companies have not been supplying enough information. How important is it for Bolsonaro to have this deal fully signed and approved this year? Thank you.
Who would like to take that one?
I can take this one. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that when it comes to Banco do Brasil, I think this is part of a larger narrative. I mean, the administration is defending a fairly robust agenda for privatizations. But the president has taken the decision to not privatize and sell majority control over the three crown jewels, which is Banco do Brasil, Caixa Econômica Federal, and Petrobras, right? And instead, to do kind of corporate governance overhaul and sell assets within those respective companies. The one SOE, which is under the potential for privatization, is the state utility company Electoral. You need Congress to approve privatizations of any of these large ones. And I think that there was a little bit of a political assessment that the appetite wasn't there to move more aggressively on the three crown jewels. Electrobras is already kind of a tough haul. We think it'll get done next year, but it's not easy to be able to ascertain. And that there's a lot of kind of low-hanging fruit to be able to move before that. So we don't see that moving this administration. There's chatter in the administration that if Bolsonaro wins re-election, that maybe he could tackle even Petrobras and maybe Bank of Brazil, but probably that's going to be for a second stage of deliberations. And when it comes to Embraer and Boeing, this is I think that that was a bit of a point of contention, but the military is comfortable with the terms of the partnership, so we don't see any resistances there, right? Maybe I'll just take the opportunity to comment as well on kind of Monica's initial comments and maybe the potential contrast between ours. I mean, actually, what's interesting is that despite being worlds apart, I actually agree with a lot of what you said, Monica. I mean, I think that this is just a matter of difference of emphasis. Listen, I fully agree that that education and particularly the environment are a liability for this administration. And, we have to look at the politics of environmental kind of, let's say, in Europe and the United States, it's really picking up tremendous steam. We look at what happened in Davos. If this coming, dry season in Brazil, the rates of deforestation pick up again, and they probably will in comparison to last year, then the economic repercussions to Brazil in the short term could be important, right? So it's not even a long-term issue. I think it's actually a short-term issue, right?
It's affecting it. It's affecting Brazil right now.
Yeah, so I actually think that this is an issue the administration is going to have to tackle, because the economic opportunity costs of not doing so in terms of financial flows, foreign direct investments, undermining the EU Mercosur trade agreement is there. I think the administration is starting to move, but they have a very antithetical and adversarial relationship with Ibami Semibil, so that it's relying on the military. But that is a hot wire issue, which I fully agree with. I think that the issue is just more of I was talking more about the emergency agenda, kind of the fiscal and some of the near term. Then it's just a comment whether that matters or not. I mean, I would say that just tax reform from all our clients we talk to in the private sector, the tremendous inefficiencies are, and transaction costs with this arcane ICMS structure. So if you deliver tax reform this year, I think it's important from a productivity and growth point of view. I wouldn't underappreciate the relevance of that. And this is an incomplete fiscal adjustment. So, it doesn't tackle these issues. I think it's just the difference of our two presentations was just on, are you focusing on near-term reform agenda versus long-term structural, but even with the caveat that actually environment is short-term as well. But anyway.
Yeah, a note on that. So I'm glad that we agree. I didn't think we did disagree, actually. I was just making a provocation.
Just framing to
you got to do these things at these
Absolutely, showmanship.
But the point that I wanted to make, it goes back to the privatization question, and it speaks directly to something that I'm currently involved in. So at the Peterson Institute where I work, I'm currently writing a book with some colleagues on economic nationalism, and so on waves of nationalism and the current rise of nationalism that we see happening around the world. And one thing that comes out and that is really interesting is that when you look at the different sort of economic nationalists we have these days. So, this is the Brexit movement. This is, the economic nationalism under Trump here in the U.S. This is, a lot of different political parties in Europe. This is the government of Hungary, of Poland, of India. That doesn't even need to be said. There are certain similarities, and there are certain things that you see happening now that have some historical echoes in the past. And Bolsonaro and his stance and his rhetoric are very much aligned with this current nationalist resurgence. Now, when you look at him and you try to say, well, but he has a liberal economic agenda, or he has a pro-market economic agenda, so he can't be all that nationalist. When you actually look at the history of, and we've had many waves of nationalism since the 19th century, which is when our research starts, what you do see is that there are waves of nationalism, or at least country-specific adaptations of economic nationalism that started out very liberal and became much more nationalist over time. So in responding to the privatization question, I would say this. Whatever the rhetoric has been and whatever the rhetoric is, doesn't mean that that is actually the policy that's going to be put in place. I'd be very, very careful in sort of taking the so-called liberal view of the economic team within this government and thinking that this is going to be seen through to the end, because ultimately there is a nationalist in power, and one would be hard-pressed to call Bolsonaro anything but a nationalist. So let me leave it there.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. I see 3 hands.
One colleague of mine who is now here just arrived as a correspondent for CBN, the National Radio Network. He's a very good journalist, and all of you will get calls from him, so you return the call. You're talking to one of the best Brazilian journalists.
Welcome.
And, you have a question?
And then we'll take, right after that, I think I'll collect a couple here in the front. We'll take 2.
I want to ask Monica de Boll and Mauricio Moura about the risk to democracy in Brazil, how it can undermine Brazilian economy. Monica was talking now about Bolsonaro being a nationalist. And we are seeing in Brazil that Paulo Guedes, the Minister of Economy, tried to approve things in Congress, but he didn't deliver anything. It was the President of the House of Representatives, Rodrigo Maia, and the President of the Senate, Davi Alcolumbre, who approved the measures. So I would like to know from you, to hear you about the risk to democracy in Brazil, how it can undermine Brazilian economy.
Thank you. And then in the front, we have the one with the scarf.
Hi, my name is Pascal Sigold. I am with Ankara Consulting. My question actually dovetails slightly the one that was just asked. I'm wondering what's your expectations about Paulo Guedes's lifetime as or future as the Minister of the Economy for Brazil.
Great. All right. Who would like to go first?
Do you want to start, Maurice?
Let's go. That's a very broad question, but let's go with what I see. Well, first of all, Paulo Guedes has become more known by the overall population. That was not the case in the beginning. He was known by a very specific group, high-income group of the Bolsonaro voters. Now he's known by he's also actually the second most known minister of the Bolsonaro government. First one is Sérgio Moro, and he also helps to divide the public opinion, because he's one of the arguments that the middle class in Brazil feels a little bit confident about the future of the economy. And every time, and I tested that a lot, every time people see, especially the low-income people in Brazil, see Paulo Guedes talking, they don't relate to him. He said something that was very tough for anyone that is unemployed in Brazil, saying that, he said, quote, "If the things doesn't turn out my way, I take the plane and go overseas." And then the guy that's unemployed watching this and say, "Oh my God, he goes overseas, how about me?" So, in the other hand, every time he goes to the international conferences, even in Davos, the middle class say, "Oh, look at our Minister of Economy. Now the things are going to go. Now we have a Minister of Economy." So he helps to divide the public opinion. It's interesting about the risk of democracy. What I feel is that higher the income, less people are concerned about the risk of democracy. This is basically a concern about the poor today. Higher the income, people say, okay, the education is not doing well, but at least we took the PT out. Okay, the environmental minister is not good, but at least he's not involved in any corruption scandal. So those are the things that I'm feeling, that the Bolsonaro government, anything that happens to increase the division in the public opinion. And also, is interesting. What I felt is interesting, that people in the low income, they understand the risk is when, for example, Bolsonaro doesn't choose the three when he choose the attorney general. He didn't choose the three main choose. So the people are falling, even if they're low income, they are following those things. When Bolsonaro wants to define who is the head of the federal police, people are concerned about that. And even it's interesting because of the people also are concerned when Bolsonaro goes to a journalist and says, "Shut up." So it's interesting that they are concerned about that. But on the other hand, the elite of Brazil and the higher income people in our surveys say, okay, that's good because now we have a good economic team and now we don't have the PT. So this is the narratives that are running right now.
We have a few minutes left. Monica?
Yeah, so on the question, I'll just briefly say that Guedes' future, everybody has been asking that question since he took office. So who knows? I have no idea. Frankly, I think that for the time being he stays, but there's just no way to predict. In terms of democracy and the economy, let me say a couple of things. First of all, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times by a political scientist this weekend that looks at exactly this question in terms of the middle class. So, there's usually this view that the middle class is pro-liberal democracy and that all of these accounts of how important the middle classes are for for democracy and for, liberal democracies and so on. But what history actually shows is something entirely different. And in the case of Brazil, and in the cases of Latin America more generally, what we do see is the middle class and the upper middle classes generally aligning with the government, whatever the leaning of that government might be. We can't forget that during the dictatorship, the upper classes and the middle classes did give the dictatorship a large amounts of support. That was not unique to Brazil, but that was certainly true in Brazil. And I think what Mauricio was just saying about the positioning of people, when you're looking at the income distribution, who cares the most about whether or not democracy is functioning properly? I don't count them amongst the upper classes. And in fact, what I do see is a kind of discourse where, more and more, what a lot of people in financial markets or in other parts of the country who belong to the so-called economic or financial elite, they're worried about the economic agenda as if the economic agenda was completely separate from anything that happens to institutions in the Brazilian democracy, which is a complete fiction or an illusion. Because obviously, if democratic institutions are weakened, and there's reason to believe, I think, that they are being weakened in Brazil by the stance of the current president and some of his ministers, that obviously is not good for the economy. So the economy does suffer in the long run. And in the short run, you also have the reverse causality effect, which is if the economy ends up doing well in the short run, that actually gives legitimacy to the weakening of institutions as perceived. So you have two problems here. These things are intimately connected, the economy and democratic institutions. When one the economy may be undermined by the undermining of democratic institutions in the long run, but in the short run, if the economy does well, and given that this is a government that is inclined to weakening democratic institutions, you might actually see that weakening happening. So for anybody who's concerned about trends in Brazil, you just can't ignore that fact. And you just can't separate the economy from everything else that's happening because it's not separable. The separation is an illusion.
But just to make clear, but people are separating them. So that's what's happening right now, especially the more educated people in Brazil.
Chris and Amy Erica, really brief.
Yeah, no, just a very quick comment, just because I can't not weigh in. But listen, I think that when we look from public opinion trends and kind of support for democratic institutions, some of the trend in the upper middle class, there is reason for worry. The reason why I'm more optimistic on the issue of democracy is that Brazil's kind of institutional framework is very, very difficult for things to get done. It's a system of multiple veto players. And I'm not really seeing signs of institutional weakening around the democracy. In fact, there might be some postures of the executive office that can be certainly criticized, but you're still looking at the independence of the judiciary, the strengthening of Congress over budgetary resources, and weakening of the executive branch. So actually, I think you can make a case that you're seeing the strengthening of democratic institutions, particularly in Congress, as an unintended consequence of this polarized politics. And so I do think that when it comes to the issue of democratic institutions, I'm less concerned. And when it comes to Paulo Guedes, everything I hear, the relationship with the president is actually pretty darn good, better than what the press suggests otherwise. Doesn't mean he'll stay throughout the remainder of this mandate, but I think that there's very, very low risk of that, anything of him leaving in the short term.
Amy Erica?
Okay. I'm going to try to say this in one sentence. I don't know if I can do that. There's a lot of political science research on the connection between democracy and the economy, and the research suggests that there is not a very strong causal linkage between democracy and economics. So I would like to think that a failure of liberal democracy will hurt the economy because it might help prop up liberal democracy in Brazil, but I'm not actually sure that that's the case.
Well, there's the long-term, short-term difference, right? So short-term, certainly it's not necessarily true because there have been many, many instances of illiberal systems where the economy has actually prospered. So
Right.
There's a timing issue. What I wanted to say, just to end, is that I hope Chris is right and I'm wrong. I do see signs of institutional weakening in Brazil, and in particular when I see, all these things and all these people protesting against the Supreme Court and calling the Supreme Court all sorts of things, as we have seen lately. So that kind of movement within society, the discrediting of other institutions that we do see, that's worrisome. And that is an erosion of perceptions that, has been building over time, but it's now being exacerbated by the positions of people within the executive branch.
Thank you. I'm going to have to cut off the debate there, fascinating though it is. We have another event coming into this room, so I'm going to ask you all to leave kind of quickly. But first, give a thanks to all of our panelists. And thank you all for joining us. We're going to have another event with Amy Erica Smith at the end of February.